Satan, Lucifer, Belial, Leviathan, Samael. Satan, I ask for your divine guidance to open the gates of infernal wisdom for the listener. Satan, rise from hell to your rightful throne above the stars of heaven and those who cast truth asunder. Leviathan, Belial, Azazel, let your knowledge shine brightly to light the way in this world subdued by ignorance. Lucifer, we build your altar of illumination amongst the thorns and thistles of lascivious hate and await your seed. Shaitan, we have come to sow our seeds into barren chambers and usher your satanic arrival triumphant. Zepar, Balan, Raum, Cain, Perkta, demons of old, come forth and reveal your wisdom and fulfill your desires. Consecro, Satanas, we shall boldly rip their temple veil from bottom to top and procure your celestial tribunal. Antichrist, seed of Lucifer, we shall await your arrival to inherit your kingdom. Satan, devour their dominion and break their vassal chains of our silence to allow truth to finally be known to all. Nephilim of old, disgrace and dishonor those who called unblemished and chosen, finally revealing their hoax, defamation, and true motivations. Astaroth, cast down their star so that it will be shattered, splintered, and scattered forever among the ephemeral winds. Asmodeus, the dust of pulverized bones shall pave the established pathway of satanic enlightenment. Satan, never again shall their lies be considered factual, their propaganda, lecherous attacks, and fallacious bloodlines revealed. Satan, Lucifer, Belial, Leviathan, Asmodeus, bestow your satanic blessings upon us. So mote it be.
Welcome. This is Aleister Nacht. I'm glad that you're with me this evening. Welcome. And satanic blessings to you. Also, to my new Patreons, welcome. I'm glad that you're here, and I certainly hope that you will get a satanic blessing and find these episodes to be value added. So welcome. In the name of Satan, we'll get started. So I hope everyone had a good week. This week was very good for the ministry. A lot of email traffic, a lot of people really getting engaged, and that's really a nice uptick. So tonight's message is satanic sacrifice, and we are going to look at this from the aspect of our coven, magnum opus, and I'm going to open some doors to you that maybe you may agree or you may disagree with, and that's okay. That's what it's all about. As I said in last week's episode, there are too many people that are really, they get their feelings hurt, too easy. So let's just toughen up. Let's be adults and, go forward and have a civil exchange of ideas. So that was last week's message, I guess. But This week we're going to focus on sacrifice. And this, for me, it's almost a sore point because I get so many people asking questions that have to do with, killing animals and torturing animals, killing humans even. And, as we go through here, we're going to talk about that because there are some beliefs out there that do embrace this. I am not one, and our coven, we do not embrace that either. I'm going to give you some easy ways to look at sacrifice and some good takeaways. Now, these have worked for me for over 25 years, and we do sacrifice rituals. We absolutely do. And they work and they're powerful, but I'm going to share with you the way that we do it and the way that we approach it. Because, going and torturing some animal and then ultimately killing it is just not going to bring you anything. Okay? So I hope that, no one here is into that. If you are, again, we can agree to disagree. I'm certainly not going to, condemn anyone for their beliefs, but it's not what we subscribe to. And I'm going to give you some good examples of that, and even some people in the left-hand path that have affirmed the same thing in the same way, and this is the way that we take it in our coven. And we don't make this up. This comes from research and asking Satanas to lead us, and asking what is expected. And so these are the things that have been revealed to us, and this is our practice. So we'll jump right into that. Now, if you have questions, be sure and put them in the chat, and I will certainly at the end of the presentation come back and we can talk about those. I'll answer those questions. If I can't answer them, I will get you an answer, or perhaps someone that is attending the event can, provide their input as well. So anyway, here we go. Sacrifice. So the first thing that we want to do is we want to charge the words. I call upon Asmodeus to satanically bless this information and facilitate the understanding. In the name of Satan, take this message and fill it full of understanding so it may be better absorbed by those who wish to do the will of Satan. In his unholy name, hail Satan, so mote it be. So there are a lot of references tonight, and I'll share those as I go through those. I have a couple of my books that I will share, but the majority of what we're going to do is we're going to look at other people's books as well. So the first thing that I want to point out here is that sacrifice is giving up something that you value without abundance. Okay? To sacrifice something because you have a whole bunch of it, or you don't even own it, is not a sacrifice. Okay? The sacrifice comes from the engagement of the heart and the spirit, the soul, the mind, all together. And it comes from a spirit of giving. An offering is giving up something to please someone, with or without abundance. So you may make an offering to Satanas, And it may be abundance, or it may be something that you do not have in abundance, but that is an offering. A donation is presenting something as a gift, a grant, or a contribution, and usually this is done through abundance. So you have some extra money, you make a donation. You have extra clothing, you make a donation. It doesn't mean that when you donate those clothes, like to a homeless shelter or a Salvation Army or something like that, it doesn't mean that you're going to go naked. It means that you have extra and you're wanting to give that away. And in a lot of ways, donations really satisfy not only the need that you're giving to, but a lot of times it'll satisfy you as an individual, feeling good, obviously, about doing something for other human beings, but it may also do you good as a tax write-off. So, you can donate something, and again, you can get something in return, the quid pro quo. So, those are the ground definitions of sacrifice, offering, and donation as we see it in Magnum Opus. So, a sacrifice is, again, giving up one thing for another considered to be of a greater value. So you make a sacrifice of something, you give something away, and it can be energy, it can be money, it can be your time, it can be your effort. It can be a lot of different things that you sacrifice. Fasting is a form of sacrifice. And so it is doing something to get something, to give away something of value, to get at least possibly something of value. Okay? This goes back to the quid pro quo, as I've mentioned so many times in previous episodes and in my YouTube videos. You give so that you can get. You sacrifice so that you can receive. If you give something and expect nothing in return, that's fine. But that is an offering. And, it may even be a donation, as we saw in the definitions there. So on my website, I was, this was back, I forget now how many years ago, maybe 10 years ago or so, maybe. I wrote an article, and it was because of the HBO series called True Detective. True Detective was filmed in and around New Orleans, out in the swamps out there. So to me, it struck a chord. Obviously being from Louisiana and loving New Orleans, it struck a chord with me. And if you haven't seen it, I'm sure you can probably get it on HBO on demand. I'd encourage you to go and take a look at it. It's good. It talks about voodoo, Satanism, some, not very much. A lot of Santeria influences, and it also mentions the marsh cult. Now, those outside of New Orleans probably won't recognize that name, the Marsh Cult, but this is actually an entity that has been around in Louisiana, more especially in southern Louisiana, closely tied with voodoo. There are some hoodoo influences as well, but the voodoo and the sacrifice comes from the Santeria. And so I wrote an article kind of, explaining what my point of view is. And, it's, to me, it really hit close to home because growing up in Louisiana, there are really two states in one state. There's northern Louisiana, and then there is southern Louisiana. And somewhere around Alexandria, maybe New Roads, uh, certainly by the time you get to Baton Rouge, you are going to experience some different culture there, spiritual culture. And so I wrote this article on it, and my belief in this, to kind of sum the article up, and again, it is on my website if you want to check that out. Um, there were groups that practiced what I consider to be maladaptive behavior in southern Louisiana. These groups possibly included child kidnap and sacrifice, and this is a very harsh reality of the left-hand path, especially those who are really um, they're way out there in the field by themselves, I would say. And we see in the news and in the media, we see things that are blamed on Satanism or, Santeria or things like that. But there are some things that do exist out there, and this being one of them. The Marsh cult was very big in the 50s and 60s and in the 70s as well. Now, by the time the 80s came along, these, I guess, sects would be the best way to explain uh, what they are. We might call them covens, but they're actually sects, they're groups. And these groups were really family based. The one part of this series that talks about Santeria and the Marsh cult and child sacrifice, the one part of that um, that is really true is the bloodlines. That New Orleans was and southern Louisiana was a mix of different cultures. And you had Haitians, you had Africans, you had the Creole, you had the, hillbillies type people, you had the aristocrats, you had the French, you had the Italians. Um, a lot of different influences mixed in and kind of mashed up into this culture that has really permeated throughout South Louisiana. And along with those people came some of the dregs of society, outlaws, pirates even, that obviously came into southern Louisiana because you could get lost and you could get away from British ships or French ships or, people that were, quote, the Coast Guard back then, that, these, quote, pirates would go out and they would make raids on these villages and towns up and down the coast, or they would go out and they would capture a vessel out in the Gulf of Mexico, and they would sequester that vessel. They would rape and pillage and take everything off of the vessel that they could take, money and gold and things like that included. Also, any of the goods that were coming in that were meant to come into New Orleans at the port, they would take all of this off of the ships. They would shoot a cannonball through the hull of the ship, sink it, and cut everyone's throat or kill them, so to speak. Or they would take some of the children and they would use them for ritual sacrifice. And they would go back up in these tributaries in southern Louisiana, and some of these areas still exist out there where they could get into these areas with their vessels, and they actually set up homesteads. A lot of backstory in that True Detective, and they do that very well. Now, the storyline, I guess, is based in fiction, but the best stories are the ones that mix a little bit of truth with the fiction. And so anyway, my take on it, again, is that there were some groups that we called maladaptive, and they were performing blood rituals. And some of them, including voodoo and voodoo, they would sacrifice animals, right? They would sacrifice chickens after they would cleanse the area. They would, sacrifice a chicken at the end of a ritual. And as we talked about last week, they would use, alcohol, usually rum, because it was so plentiful, to be able to spew on the animal, the chicken. Then they would use cigars and cigar smoke and things like that. Anyway, I digress, probably more than you wanted to know, but it kind of gives you a little backstory into my line of thought. And the fact that there were disappearances up and down what they considered to be the Creole Nature Trail, which does exist. It's a long, expansive highway that runs through southern Louisiana, and it is between towns, very, very desolate out there. And we would hear about, children disappearing, children being sacrificed, and these are, again, the groups that I can only describe as maladaptive. They were criminals, they were outlaws, and, more frighteningly, they were the real satanic panic. And what's interesting is during the 80s, the satanic panic would show all of these things that supposedly happened all through the world. But what's interesting is they never would pick up an article down there. And there was a lot of reasons why, because there were a lot of people, influential people, that were connected with that. And as the saying goes, you don't want to end up alligator bait. So, silence is golden, so to speak. The Santeria little section here, as they're going through their rituals, they would sacrifice, and probably still do, sacrifice animals. And they would bring these animals in cages, and, pretty much at the crescendo of the ritual, they would sacrifice the animals. Again, all of the animals would be sacrificed. We know that human sacrifice has taken place from millennia, and the Aztecs practiced it. They discovered, the mechanisms for doing so, their approach, their methodology for doing this. Obviously they would ask for any types of blessings and, good crops, good health, and, some of these were volunteers. In fact, usually the records that do exist indicate that most of these were volunteers, and it's very gruesome. If you've never done some research on how the sacrifice actually worked, they would cut the sternum open while the person was, obviously conscious, and pull the heart out with it beating. So very gruesome. And they felt that adrenaline rush and that release of adrenaline and blood made the sacrifice more effective. And that is something that is still in existence today. And these maladaptive these maladaptive groups that still practice this type of sacrifice. And many still do that with animals, and they believe that by getting the animal so frightened and releasing that adrenaline will release more power and more energy into the blood of the animal that they will then use or consume that blood from that animal. And one thing to note is that when the adrenaline is released in any animal, human as well, it taints the meat. In many cases, it makes it unedible. Not that you would eat a sacrifice, but the slaughterhouses and the meat market industry for pork and beef and everything else has kind of figured out that if you do create this fear and this panic in the animal, it will probably make the meat unedible, or it will make it so, what they call, gamey tasting, that it's really not the way to go, because you can't sell your meat at a higher price. They still discover, in this example, over 650 skulls and thousands of fragments from what the Aztecs did. And they would have these rituals on days, and they would go on and on and on and on, and they would have victim after victim or volunteer. Now, there's also records to indicate that not only were these volunteers who believed that they would get something better, or come back in some other spirit, but they would also take the criminals or people that they did not like. This was also a way of settling old scores. Like any human sacrifice, there are going to be those that the high priest is going to go ahead and settle some old scores from the past, and so this obviously happens as well. And what's referred to as Germany Stonehenge, which is an area that kind of appears like Stonehenge, they also discovered a lot of remains from human sacrifice as well. So this practice has gone on since the beginning of time. And some would even say that in the biblical story of Cain and Abel, that it was actually a sacrifice to Satan to have the brother murder the brother. And so there's, those that are proponents of that belief. And obviously it could be, if that story is true and accurate, then it certainly could be. And then obviously the Vikings, the pagans, and you know that the Scandinavians as a whole, they did what was called blood sacrifices as well. And there are a lot of areas where you can actually go and you can still see the remnants of what was considered to be these outdoor areas where they would make sacrifices to Odin and Thor and different ones, those being human sacrifices as well. Another good show that I really enjoyed was the series Vikings that was on, I think it was on one of the Discovery channels or something like that. I'm not sure, but it really depicted some of the human sacrifice, the voluntary human sacrifice of people in the group who would give their life so that the crop would be good, the harvest would be good. Usually, there would be a sacrifice if a new baby was coming into the clan or the group. And so these things again have happened since the beginning of time. The Druids here also, the same thing, even cannibalism as well. And so you've got these lines, these bloodlines, and these lineages, and nowadays we kind of water it all down. But if you track these things back, these were very real people and real events. And, they sacrificed animals and people. It was a part of their lives, and it was just as common as a Christian going to church or, anything else. It was what they believed and what they did. And so there's still a lot of evidence in that. Prosh. Also, there are certain groups like the Order of Nine Angles that practiced sacrifice back in their beginnings, and as they splintered off from other beliefs and other belief systems, they certainly believed in it and certainly practiced it. Now, I don't know about today. I'm not really around the organization or connected to that organization in any manner, but these are the roots, and you can't ignore the roots. To eliminate one part of history is to rewrite history, and it does no one any good. Also, one thing to note here is that the ONA, as they're often called, their approach has been altered from willing sacrificial victims, what they started with, like an initiated priest, to that of unwilling sacrificial victims. So, while there are elements of the satanic panic that absolutely were not true, and in many cases proven to be not true, there were a lot of organizations that operated and still operate in the shadows. And, some of those lineages and family trees still exist. And you're not going to find an article on CNN or in a news periodical about this stuff. They're very effective and very efficient at what they do. It's also something to point out here is that there are popular Luciferians who have connections with the ONA. It's documented and it's proven, and I won't say that this is good or bad. It's just a statement of fact. And many of them have tried to suppress that affiliation, and that's obviously their business. I'm not here to criticize, but again, history is what history is. In a book from Melvin Harris, he actually put forward a theory that this Robert Donston Stevenson, who he believed was the Ripper in England, in London, he actually believed, and he put forward in his books, he wrote 2 or 3 books on Jack the Ripper, and was, referred to as the expert on the subject. But he put forth that this person actually did these murders as blood sacrifices for black magic. Now, that's not substantiated, and there are those who rebuke that and counter that by saying that Stevenson was actually in jail at the time, but the records that they have for that, there's a lot of speculation around those records, and the fact that some of the guards may have gone back and doctored those records a little bit because of their negligence. So it's really interesting, and again, I don't know what the truth is in this matter, and I'm certainly not an expert or even a buff when it comes to, Jack the Ripper. But interesting information if you're into that type of information. It's really interesting. Now we also find in the demonic Bible, there's a little comment here. Civilizations rose to power and raised up animalistic deities as gods, who now demanded worship and sacrifice in return for their beneficence and blessings. The threat was no longer against the individual man, but now against an entire society. So this is a really interesting comment from this book, because it does go straight to the heart of society as a whole benefiting from some sort of sacrifice, and therefore it was justified. And this is, again, nothing new. As we've seen in the last few slides here, it's been going on in all cultures, and it has been normalized because of the thought that as society we will sacrifice for the good of society because it will benefit all of society. So it's kind of, again, the quid pro quo. We will kill this individual or these people as sacrifices, and we will expect something in return for that. An interesting comment in The Fortunes of Faust, one line really stands out: sacrifice of himself to himself. And this is something that begins to really, I guess, pave the way for some of the more contemporary magicians, such as Aleister Crowley. In his Magic in Theory and Practice, he writes, But the bloody sacrifice, though more dangerous, is more efficacious. And for nearly all purposes, human sacrifice is the best. The truly great magician will be able to use his own blood, or possibly that of a disciple, and that without sacrificing the physical life irrevocably. So we begin to see that Aleister Crowley, who I believe was, he was certainly on the cutting edge, so to speak, of magical practice. Now, some will argue that he went insane, and I do believe that he did eventually. But he made some really great strides in magic, and here we see that he is a proponent for not sacrificing the physical, but using the blood as a donation from the priest, the priestess, or a disciple in lieu of that. He also goes on to say, as many deities demand sacrifice, one of men, one of cattle, a third of doves, let these sacrifices be replaced by the true sacrifices of your own heart. Yet, if thou must symbolize them outwardly for the hardness of the heart, let thine own blood and no others be spilt before that altar. So again, here what we're seeing is, although it was acceptable in some circles to sacrifice animals, he goes a step further to say the sacrifice really is in your own self. And that really rings true, especially as, again, he reiterates in the book of the law, I guess, quatrain or paragraph number 58. I give unimaginable joys on earth, certainly not faith, while in life upon death. Peace utterable, rest ecstasy, nor do I demand aught in sacrifice, nor do I demand anything in sacrifice. We also see from Michael Aquino in his book Black Magic. He says unequivocally he draws the line in the sand. Under no circumstances is any life form ever sacrificed or injured in a black magical working of the Temple of Set. Violation of this rule will result in the offender's immediate expulsion and referral to law enforcement or animal protection authorities. So he's very straightforward in this, and I think he really came into making this statement because he too had reached a point where he was tired of hearing people bring up the sacrifice thing and address it over and over and over, that no, we do not sacrifice animals, no, we do not sacrifice humans. So here it is in black and white once again. In my book, Satanism and Devil Worship, I add, the thoughts of the practitioner actually drive the ritual, and even the sacrifice ritual, must use imagination to be fully realized. Thoughts and ideas are what stimulate the magus to open a ceremony and expect the result of the casting of a spell or hex. Without the powerful mind, we as followers of the left-hand path are rendered impotent. So again, I believe that sacrifice is a personal thing. It's a personal action It's a personal act. It's not something that you can go out and do to something else or someone else and expect something from that. And then I also mention in my Wasted Faith book, world religions such as Christianity, Islam, and Judaism all embody a tradition and sometimes bizarre set of animal sacrifice rituals in the holy context. And these practices, despite being borderline barbaric and not in keeping with modern ideas of animal welfare, are still in use today by religious communities all over the world, including in the most modern countries. So again, these things happen. And if you look in the Bible, in the Christian Bible, the Jews expect a Messiah. And one of the things that this Messiah is going to do is rebuild the temple on the original temple site. And that location has actually been debated as well. Some believe that that site is at the Weeping Wall, while others believe that the original temple was outside of the walls that are represented today, and that those walls were actually the Roman, I guess, guard location or base, you might say, and that the real temple is actually outside of that, real easy to access. And so this Messiah is going to rebuild this temple and allow, finally, animal sacrifices in that new temple. So again, a sacrifice is an action to give up something that you currently possess, want, or need in order to receive a greater value. The sacrifice obviously must have an objective, and it's usually performed via quid pro quo type arrangement with Satanas, or a demon or an entity for which you are working. In Magnum Opus, we practice sacrifice by proxy. This is a physical symbolism, really, and it can be highly individualized. It can be a pinprick, it can be a knife cut of the hand or finger or something like that, the letting of blood. Back in the 80s, and especially going into the 90s with AIDS and different diseases that would come from blood, this practice was, I will say, it evolved into more sterile environments. It used to be, a prick on the finger with the athame, or a cut of the hand with the athame. But obviously, with all of these different diseases and infection and things like that, those who practice this have gotten smarter about it, and it serves the purpose. And the whole idea of the objective is of the self, by the self, for the self. Now, one thing to point out in sacrifice, and a lot of people really lose sight of this, is if it is not of value directly to you, it is not a sacrifice. And this takes the idea of murdering an animal, sacrificing an animal, and totally debunks that. Okay? If the animal belongs to you, even, it debunks that. Now, We mentioned, or one of the attendees, when we talked about sacrifice a little bit, someone brought up the point that maybe during the old times they would actually sacrifice an animal that was their most important animal because it was, money to them. It was currency. And in a lot of instances, it was a difference between life and death. You use the animal for food, you use its milk for food, you use its hair, and, things like that for clothing. So it was life in itself. So I can see where that, back then would have been something that logically would have made sense to a practitioner. Nowadays, I don't agree with that. So, if it is something that is of value to you and you only, that is sacrifice. You're giving the known for the unknown. If it's not of value directly to you, it's not a sacrifice, plain and simple. Do you ever experience discomfort when you're giving the item? I mean, do you ever think, oh, if I give this money, I may be short on my bills, or, I've got this money, but I'm really planning to do something with it, or I've got this particular thing that I'm going to sacrifice, I'm going to burn this on the altar, but it's the only one. I'll never replace it. Well, you have to ask these questions because in Magnum Opus, our formula is sacrifice plus time equals expectation. So you have to imagine, or you have to come up with, what is the sacrifice? How much time? And the time may be unlimited, but there should be an expectation connected to that. If the sacrifice is not there, or the sacrifice does not mean anything to you, again, murdering an animal, then it doesn't matter how much time is there, you're not going to get the expectation. And again, if you make the sacrifice and you're watching your watch, after that, okay, Satan, I make this sacrifice to you. Okay, it's been an hour. Why am I not getting what I want? Well, that timeline is not yours. So, again, you're going to have all of those ingredients. And you should not have negative reservations about the sacrifice. I know that giving something that you value hurts. You got it. That is the lesson for today. But that is what makes sacrifice. It is the spirit of sacrifice and the spirit of giving. And also keep in mind that sacrifice is cyclical. It's not linear. It's not one and done. It's something that may take multiple sacrifices in order to get what you're expecting, whatever that expectation is. And one last thing is, you should not attach ancillary requirements or restrictions to the sacrifice. Begrudging will only negate the sacrifice. Okay? Here's some money. I could have been doing something else with this. Blah, 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 blah. Doing it like that is going to negate the sacrifice. So keep that in mind. The sacrifice itself is really something personal. It's between you and Satanas. It's not between you and anyone else. If you're operating in a coven setting, it can be between the coven and Satanas. But you have to align the minds as you're going into that ritual, so that you truly understand that that sacrifice means something, and it means something to everyone. A lot of times it can be an investment of time. It can be fasting. It can be any of these things that are done as a group. A fast is wonderful because you are sacrificing something of your physical body, the prime need that you have to replenish and to eat. I mean, that is in itself a base need. If you look at Maslow's triangle, his hierarchy of needs, it is at the very bottom. So you have to have that before you go any further up that triangle, as we talked about in earlier episodes. So this week in the questions, so I had a question about liminal deities. So if you're unaware of what liminal deities are gatekeepers. That's all. They're described as cherubims. They're described as demons. They're described of many different descriptions, and these are nothing more than tags, so to speak. But at the end of the day, they are keepers of the gate in some capacity. And as we know, there are legions of demons who are keepers of the gate. And, they unlock the secrets of some gates. They allow you to pass through those gates in the astral nature. So that is what liminal deities are, and that's what the question was, is what are they? And I guess it came up through some reading or something like that, so that is your answer. Liminal deities are keepers of the gate. And, when you are going through the veil in the astral, and you're working with demons and beings and bringing, calling them to come through, and you're going through in the astral, there are certain liminal deities that you will deal with in certain manners. And I do speak about some of these liminal deities that I use in my book, Sanctum of Shadows, Volume 2, Corpus Satanis. So if you haven't checked that out, I do list some entities that I work with and Magnum Opus works with that have been very successful. And then the second is not really a question, but I wanted to kind of follow up from last episode. We talked about Florida water, and I also took a little snippet of that and put it on YouTube. And I had a question about Florida water, and I think there may be a little bit of confusion. I think I said, don't drink this, and that's exactly what I mean. Don't drink this. This is not for human consumption. Anything that has cologne on the outside of the bottle marked, it should not be consumed. So the question was kind of around, well, could I use it as, a not only a cleanser and a cologne, I guess, but could I actually drink it? Could I take those things in? And I would say no, absolutely not. That is not what this is used for. Just like you really would not want to drink isopropyl alcohol, rubbing alcohol, you would not want to drink this stuff. Who knows what it would do to you. It's not made for public consumption. If you're going to consume something, I do have some recipes for for things. I have a Diabolos Geis, which is something that we use a lot in our, as our elixir during rituals. And it's based on a very dark German beer with some cherry schnapps mixed into it, and it is good if you want alcohol during your ritual for your chalice. You can certainly use that, but don't drink Florida water. I worry about that when I start getting questions from people. I don't want someone to hurt themselves with something like this, so please don't do that. So I wish you the very best. Again, thank you for being here. Thank you for being a Patreon. I send you satanic blessings for this week. Something good is going to happen to you, and we will thank Satanas for that. So until next time, this has been Aleister Nacht. Hail Satan.